Welcome to Well, Why Not? Conversations about opening your mind, then your passport. My name is Deborah and I'm a first-generation Haitian American who decided to leave the U.S. several times during my adult life. Currently, I live in Quito, Ecuador, where I've been for the past 4 years. I'd like to share more about my journey with you and invite others who have taken the leap to move away from the familiar, mainly in the form of immigration or expatriation. Greetings. Welcome back to those who have tuned in to previous episodes, and welcome to those of you who are tuning in for the first time. Have you ever heard of that phrase, money will only make you more of what you already are? I, for some reason, always thought that it came from Bill Gates or some other billionaire. But when I Googled it in preparation for this episode, I found that the original author is someone called T. Harv Eker. But the reason why this phrase resonates with me is because I feel you can take out money and switch it with expatriating. And you have pretty much the same idea. So expatriating, if you choose to emigrate, it will only make you more of what you already are. And I actually started thinking more about this last year when the Black Lives Matter movement was on the news and really was gaining traction, and just all the social injustices, racism, all of that was going on, that had been going on. It just was being televised, and some people were facing consequences for it. But I think that also led to a certain pocket of people of color, especially African Americans, who felt the need to somewhat escape the U.S. because there was this feeling of things can never get better, or will never get better, just based off of history and all the things that have been fought for in the past, but we continue to have to fight for. And I understood it. I totally understood that sentiment. And then it was great because I think that also led a lot of people to start researching other countries, whether they were predominantly Black countries or countries in South America or even countries in Asia. But it was with this idea that they were going to escape the problems that they were facing every day. And I think on the surface it could seem that way, but I really think that deep down, problems usually, for the most part, it's not a blanket statement, but for the most part, if you're unable to face or deal with certain problems in one space, you're most likely going to be unable to face and deal with problems in a different space. Although the problem may tweak, it may not look the exact same, it's still a problem. It's still something that's difficult. It's still something that's challenging you. And I think that's something or learning to deal with that, learning to cope, learning to move past those things and still find happiness, still find joy, that comes from within. That actually, I don't think that's an external factor in our lives. And so I always look at, and I don't like to make comparisons. I always try to avoid comparing, whether it's people, places, cultures, but I can draw similarities and sort of help put things into perspective by doing that. So when we talk about something as big as racism, racism in the U.S. looks very different than racism elsewhere. I remember, and I feel like I may have talked about this in a previous episode, when I studied abroad in France, and I think I did arrive in France with this idea that the racism against Black people that I knew existed, that had been institutionalized in the U.S., did not exist in France because they don't have a history of institutionalized racism. So of course it's going to be at least that. Not to say that I didn't expect to face challenges or, get get accustomed to a brand new culture, but I didn't think that I was going to see racism overall. And to my surprise, not only did I see it, I saw it more towards people of Arab descent. So any, people who came from Algeria, Morocco, all those places, all those immigrants who actually for generations at that point had been in France. It was jarring to see I immediately saw, especially in big cities, because they, in the rural areas they're not as diverse. So I immediately saw the treatment of people of Arab descent being treated like Black people were treated, I would say. Well, I can't, I don't think any of us could say were treated, right? But what was institutionalized, or what was very much accepted in the era of segregation, in the era of, just the civil rights movement, that's sort of what I saw. I saw people literally, moving to the other side of the street when they saw someone who looked of Arab descent, or I heard people just yelling slurs at people who looked of Arab descent, because sometimes you just don't know. I mean, I've seen people who are interracial, like Black and white, who somewhat look a little like they may have some family, some distant relative of Arab descent, but it's hard to know. It's hard to guess. So I always felt like they were just assuming. They just assumed the person, because the person looked a certain way, they assumed that's what they were, and so they felt okay in yelling those slurs or saying very prejudiced things. I mean, I learned that neighborhoods that were predominantly made up of people of Arab descent, like pizzas wouldn't be delivered there. Certain services just wouldn't go there because of that. So that's where I sort of likened it to that sort of segregation era. Although again, it wasn't institutionalized. That's for sure. It's like these companies, I don't think, are necessarily putting it in writing that they would never go or never service these neighborhoods, but it existed. It was happening, and people knew about it, and it was just a thought or a fact. It was just a fact. And I think I found, like, even Black people in France sort of justified it. That's how much it was sort of accepted and ingrained, and the propaganda around what it meant to be of Arab descent. It infiltrated everywhere. And so even other people who, to me, should be allies and should say, no, it's not okay to treat somebody differently because of their ethnicity, they kind of got swept into, but they are this way, but they do tend to do these things. Now, granted, this was now 20 years ago, but I do remember when the Charlie Hebdo shooting happened, and that was sort of the conflict as well, when people came out to protest in support of free speech, because they felt that the attack was an attack on free speech. And I think that publication did have those tendencies as well. So again, I don't know how much people even knew about that, but if you looked, yes, they were very controversial, but they actually did print some racist things, and it wasn't like 20 years ago, it was recent. Like, that was the type of publication that it was or is. And so while there were people who were out there and wanted to protest what had happened and support free speech in general, there were the French, or I don't know if it's French Arab or Arab French, that's why I say those of Arab descent, who were on the other side saying, yeah, that's great that you want to support free speech, but you also have to recognize the inequalities. You have to recognize the attacks on certain cultures, on certain ethnicities, and certain races. And are you okay with that? And that sort of I remember kind of watching closely. I have friends who live in Paris, and they didn't get as much attention, of course, as those who were out there in support of free speech. But when I heard it, I just thought, oh, so it hasn't changed. It still is a very, very real problem. So I mean, starting from that reason to escape where you are, if you are a person, what we are now, I guess, labeling BIPOC, a Black, Indigenous person of color, and you are looking to escape social injustices, racism, prejudice, all of those things. You will find them everywhere, and it's sad, but I'm trying to think of even places that were not colonized. So I've had the opportunity to visit the Middle East, and so some of those countries were never ever colonized, and so you can't necessarily blame it on that or link it to that. Although I think colonization, the word colonization is broad, and sometimes we only think of it as, oh, another country came into, or a country went into another country, took control of all their resources, took control of their political, education, economic systems, and ran it for a certain amount of time. That's usually how we see colonization, but I think recently at least for me, I've broadened my understanding of colonization. It's much more than that. It includes, people could be mentally colonized. Sometimes it wasn't that they were invaded or occupied by another country. It was just simply the influence, or there was such an economic influence from another country that eventually sort of affected or impacted the local culture as well. So when I say, I guess I'm using that broad stroke of colonization, that no, another country did not come in and run the show for a period of time, but you see things like lightening creams, skin bleaching products, people that are, in general, beauty is looked at, people with fairer skin, and I'm trying to think, I feel like, Indian culture, for instance, has a lot of this as well. And I know that they were colonized, but it's just how long does that last? And even when the majority of the people are of a certain complexion, are melanated, it's still very, very much apparent. And like I said, it's not necessarily like, I know this is a big thing in Nigeria, but when you see that, you realize, oh, although they may not label it as racism, but for me as a Black person, seeing somebody purposely try to remove their melanin because they believe that that's what's beautiful and that's what's desirable, I can't help but to link it to racism. I can't help but link it to prejudice and all those thoughts that come with teaching people that you should judge others by the color of their skin or by their race. So, the whole racism thing again, I just believe if you are unable to deal with it in one space, I really don't know. And maybe there is a spot, a corner on this earth where you can go and people will accept you exactly for what you are. You will accept others for exactly who they are, and that it doesn't exist. I don't know. Maybe if it does, please share. But as far as I know, almost everywhere you go, you will see some version of it. And so that to me kind of reminds me again, if you are a person who hasn't learned, and it's unfortunate that we have to learn it, but it's the reality. We have to learn it. You have to learn how to deal with it. If you haven't learned how to deal with it, then escaping from one place to another is not going to eliminate the problem. You're going to face it in a different way, and either you will maybe choose to ignore it when it comes packaged differently, or you'll again be frustrated. I say all that recognizing also that the US has a special brand of racism, and there's a lot of violence that comes with it. It is different. And I know a lot of people also were talking about, like, I fear for my safety. I fear for the safety of my family. I fear, parents fearing for the safety of their children. Yes, no, in that case, I'm not trying to at all minimize feeling that way and choosing to leave because of that to a safer place, even if racism exists. The racism that I have faced living in South America has never been violent. I've never felt unsafe, thank goodness. And I think even if I were to, I've never felt unsafe in general, but I'm just thinking, like, if I were ever in a situation in public where I felt like people are looking at me a certain way, or I feel like I'm a little bit targeted, I may assume that it's because I'm a woman, because I also know that machismo exists here too, like at a very high level. And so I think I would have, or I may think it's that versus, I'm not safe because I'm a Black person. But yeah, I want to put that out there as, like, I'm not at all saying somebody should not leave a space where they're not feeling safe at all. Just that the assumption that racism only exists in certain places, that's a fallacy. So I think it's helpful to get the tools. And I feel like maybe that's a whole other episode. Like, how do you learn to deal with racism? How do you learn to counteract it? How do you learn to never lose your sense of self, your sense of self-worth, even if you're in a space where, people who are melanated are not valued. So yeah, I think that will be another episode. Another good example, though, that I have of people, like, escaping via expatriation is people think, living in the US, I agree, living in, most global, like what we say, the global north and the global south. But yeah, when you look at Europe and, and when I say Europe, Western Europe, of course, it's expensive. So you always hear too how people will want to go to a place with lower cost of living. And I've had people reach out to me too, because they see that I've done it for a long time. So they think, oh, it's feasible. And it is, it absolutely is. But I think the assumption that you can magically save money and just have a really high quality of life outside of, let's say, the US or France or the UK is not, it's not a given. And I say that because oftentimes I think we overlook, especially in American culture, the way that we learn to manage money, or we don't learn to manage money. So people often live beyond their means, and it's almost like it's a hamster wheel, and you get into that cycle, and you get in, and you're in a society that is constantly bombarding you with, buy this, and you got to change this, and you got to upgrade that, and now there's this new phone out, and all of that. So I think if you leave with the idea that you're going to unlearn those behaviors, yes. But oftentimes people don't. And it's hard to unlearn those behaviors as well. But if you're leaving thinking that, I'm spending more than I earn right now, but it's only because, the cost of living is high. It's not. It's really because of the choices you make. And I like to think that there are a lot of things we're not in control of, but we are in control of our finances. So that's another sort of escapist mentality that I always think, it's a trap. Like, don't think that, because another mistake that often people make is assuming that whatever you earn, like, I'm making 50K here, but of course, but I'm spending 60K, but I can spend 30K living in Panama. But you're not going to be making 50K anymore. You're most likely going to be making a salary adjusted for Panama. Now, I know even before the pandemic, but even more so now, there are more remote opportunities. So technically, you could be earning a salary that's adjusted for a place that you're not living, so a place with a higher cost of living, and that gives you an advantage. But what I've seen, I'd say in the last 6 months as well, is many companies, if they're putting out a position remote and they're giving you options to live wherever you want to live, they tell you that your salary will be adjusted based on where you live. So in that case, again, you just have to learn to manage your money better. It's not leaving, like changing, your atmosphere, or changing your geographic location is not going to all of a sudden make you a better money manager. That's a skill, again, that you have to learn wherever you are. And then just, something as simple as, if you're a negative person, if you're a person that has a hard time seeing the good in things around you, even when it feels like everything is chaotic and everything is, just going south, but and yet you're able to still identify moments of happiness, moments of joy, just the good and the good in humanity, then great. I think that you'll do that wherever you are. But on the other side, if you're a person that has a hard time seeing the good, and seeing bad news or having a bad experience will just throw you off, and you have a hard time recovering from that, don't think that it's because you're in the U.S. I think it's something that's within us. It's something internal that you have to learn to work on. And if you work on it and you become a more positive person, a more optimistic person, again, you may not even see the need to now change geographic locations, but you may still. And if you do, again, you will take that with you. That ability to turn a bad situation, or to turn an obstacle into an opportunity, that you can take with you. And in those cases, I definitely encourage somebody to move and to take the leap. Again, just to reiterate, things that you can escape: gun violence. Yes, like the U.S., like I said, has a very, it's a very violent culture. And I think it's been established. If you make the comparison with other quote unquote industrialized nations, it just, the frequency of gun violence, of assault and all of that, it is very high. You can escape also, like that individualistic lifestyle that I talked about on the previous episode, that if you're looking for people who just want to live in a community, although you could do that within the U.S. I think there are places, there are small towns, and even to go farther, like I think groups that have made that choice to sort of live off the grid and to live simple lives. There's the whole tiny home movement happening. So I think there's ways to do that without expatriation. You don't necessarily have to make that switch into a place where you don't know the culture that well, or you don't know the language that well, which will just add on to, making your assimilation and adaptation into that space a little bit more difficult. And I think also, like little things like a society that values, like, the American culture highly values professional accomplishments, which is fine. But if you're looking to escape that and say, I'd rather live in a society that values family, that values experiences, that too. But I think, again, making a blanket statement about American culture is not 100% accurate. There are so many different pockets, and so many different states and small towns and small cities and big cities, and even from one city to the next, it's so different. So I guess if those are the initial things that you're looking for, except for the gun violence, except for violence in general, I think you can potentially find it within the same country. You just have to get a little bit farther away from urban spaces where those things tend to be more frequent. So, if you've thought of living abroad, what are some of the reasons you've wanted to make that leap? I'm curious to know. And again, if you know of a place in this world where that is void of racism, I'd like to know. Please share in the comments below. That's it for this episode. Until next time, be well.